Hey guys, so in this video we're gonna go more in depth into how we're gonna manipulate the game objects in 3D or in 2D. Unity way of manipulating them while using the world's client with GS2. So first off, let's start with a component that is present on every single game object, which is the transform. The transform is basically the position of the game object, its state, the position in the world, its rotation. As you can see, every time I change it, the values change accordingly, and its scale. Well, let me get a cube for a better example. So let's go again with the transform, the scale on the different axes, the rotations, and the positions. Now, this is basically a transform, and you can access each element like the position, the rotation, the scale, and the transform has its own methods. For example, like a translate, which moves the transform, which changes the position accordingly. And these actual methods and all can be found in the documentation for transform, in the actual Graal 3D documentation found in the link below. Now, something crucial to understand is that from this transform, the position, rotation, and scale are actually vector 3. Well, a vector tree is simple. It's just the x, y, and z inside one single object. So position dot x would give me 1.73 in this case. Position dot y minus 0.04. Position dot z minus 1.2. And these vector tree can actually be manipulated. Also, you can find every single method for them inside the documentation for vector tree. For example, you can go with vector tree dot dot or dot product to actually multiply two vector trees, or you can have vector tree dot add to actually sum two vector trees, for example, if to get a new vector tree which is another position, or you can have vector tree dot normalize to actually have the vector be at length 1, which is basically vector math. Now, vector trees are really important, especially in Unity 3D, and the scaling to all that when you go to 2D will be with vector 2, essentially, which only have x and y. Now to give an actual concrete example of the manipulation. Well, remember the weird bullet that spawned in the asset bundle tutorial? Well, let's use that. So, the way to actually access a transform is to go from the game object dot transform. So in this case, this is the bullet, which is the game object variable dot transform, and access whatever we want: the position, the rotation, the scale. So for example, I can write right here this dot bullet dot transform dot local scale. This is the name of the scale variable, and I'm gonna get a vector tree. Now to create in GraalScript 2 a new vector tree, we write v3, open the parentheses, give it x, y, and z. So let's make local scale on 1, normal on x, twice as long on y, and 3 times as big on z. Now if I run this code and hit apply, as we can see, the scale is very different. It has extended on z, which is the depth, and extended on y, which is the height, and is the same on x. Now, if we want to actually use the vectors and math, exactly what we do with the position. Now, for the position, we're actually checking the player position, getting the game object from the player using the actual model, getting a transform this game object, checking its position, and adding to it a vector tree that just adds 2 steps on the y. So it's not on the player exactly, it's just 2 steps above him, which we can see right here. It's not exactly on the player, it's 2 Unity steps, let's say, above him. And basically that's the simplest way of seeing how to manipulate the game object. Now, you can have a lot of things that are really inside the documentation. Now, to give an example of how documentation looks like, this is the vector 3 documentation script. Just you can search for it, you can easily search for transform also. And basically, you can see here that a vector 3 dot magnitude will give me the length of the vector. So if it's a 1, 0, it's a 1, 1, 1, it should be of length like 1, or like it's a 1. I'm not sure about the math. There's like actual vector math to go for it. But yeah, normalize will just return me a new vector of length 1. For example, the 1, 0, 1 maybe turn into square root of 2, 0, square root of 2. Square magnitude would not have the square root, basically. It's just the calculation. Now, other vector 3, for example, vector 3 back, this is exactly like saying a new v3 that is 0, 0, minus 1. Back, down, forward, and everything like that, basically. And these are like the actual vector variables. There can also be the x, y, and z, easiest thing to access and most important thing to access. For example, right here, I can always have player.chat, well, display the bullet, dot position, dot x, and I can make it, well, rotate on the x-axis, dot Euler angles. It's not rotation exactly, it's just the name of the variable. And I'm gonna add v3 0.1, 0, 0. And yeah, from the doc you can also see like the functions like add, divide vectors with a variable, or multiply. For example, if I have v3 1, 1, 1 and I want to turn it like 3, 3, 3, I can just dot multiply 3, normalizing, getting the scale of the vector, and really all the methods that are for vector 3. Now, analyzing this documentation also works for a transform, to actually see what to use, how to use it, and everything. And it's really just anything that works in Unity can be translated like that to GraalScript 2. So .x in Unity, vector3.x in Unity is same vector3.x here. Now sometimes syntax may change, specifically using the double columns, but like in Unity is vector3 dot right. Here is vector3 column right. It's small nuances that can be found in documentation when actually comparing both. Now, a great thing about Unity is it allows us to actually find its game objects and name them according to what we need. So in that case, let's say I made the mistake to write not this dot bullet, but temp dot bullet. Now this object will not be called onUpdate because it's a different variable and it's temporary to asset bundle to the asset bundle downloaded function, and I will never be able to have access to it on update. Now, of course, imagine the case where it is an object from another script or something that exists already inside the level and it was not spawned dynamically. So let's first give this object a name. So temp.bullet.gameObject.name. Let's give it the name my new bullet. Now, if we run this code, we do see that the actual bullet does not follow us, but when we open the hierarchy viewer, or pressing the F9 key to actually see the hierarchy of every single object in this actual level, and we go down, we can see right here that this object we created is my new bullet. Now, since we have the name, we can do something like this. Now we can go ahead and write this dot bullet is equal to game object find, and we'll give it the name. Now if I hit apply, I can move around with the object on top of my head. Even though we did not instantiate into the this.bullet variable, but since we found it, Unity put the reference into this new variable, and now we can manipulate it again. Now, the same idea to this find game objects in the world applies to the components of a game object. Now, what is a component? Well, look at these two different game objects. Well, this is a game object, it's empty, it has nothing inside. Well, there's a sphere, which is also a game object, but it has like the sphere mesh filter, the mesh filter, and the sphere collider. Well, all these are their own separate components. So a sphere collider is just a collider that works with the engine, with a 3D engine. It can be edited, changing the radius, the center, going at 0, to actually create a different collider box for the physics. Now, these specific components are far and varied. The cool thing about Unity is that you can create your custom component. The downside is this custom component use C# code and cannot be written in JS2. So what we use for GraalScript 2 is actually the base component. For example, just an audio source or 2D box collider, physics 2D, whatever. All the components are available. Now, on the good side, everything that can be done via code and custom components can be done via scripting in GraalScript 2. Now, the way to actually get access to these components is to actually get to the game object that we want the component accessed from and just write a get component. So right here, if I want to get, say, a component, I just write, and in that way, I now have access to sphere collider. So if I put in a variable, so temp.sphere, now I can just temp.sphere.radius is equal to 10. Now I've changed the radius dynamically through code. It's not going to be able to show you because the radius is actually invisible. It's just the actual collider of the circle that will change. But yeah, that's really how it works. I would also highly recommend just go checking online, checking documentation, the Unity documentation, and some Unity guides also, a bit more detailed to actually dive a bit deeper into components, because like you can get component, but you can actually add them also dynamically via code. And all these methods are written in the documentation and they are available online with their equivalent in the documentation for GraalScript 2. So yeah, just go ahead and look at them and see how it's written and how it's used, and this should come really naturally with practice. Now, another thing that is really cool about Unity is the fact that transform can be parented, or game objects can be parented. So what does parenting means? It means that as a parent, whatever happens to the parent game object also happens to the child game object. So let me create a sphere. This is my parent game object. And let me create a cube. This is my child game object. Now, right now there are two different game objects. Once I drag the cube onto the sphere, we can see they are parented. Now, if I move the cube a bit away, it moves alone because it's a child. When I move the sphere, as you can see, the cube moves exactly the same way. If I rotate it by like 40 degrees, also rotated from the center of the sphere. Well, what does that mean? It means that we can manipulate object based on other object in a more efficient way. We have linked them in a way together. So now if I destroy the sphere, it will also destroy the cube. But if I destroy the cube, it will not interfere with the sphere. Now this is an important concept because if we go back to our GraalScript 2 example. Now right here, we're always on every single frame checking the player position and actually copying it to the bullet position. But what we want to do is actually remove this update and just go ahead and write the bullet dot game object dot transform dot parent is equal to the player transform. Now it looks like it shouldn't work anymore, but because the transform actually follows the same changes and movements identically to its parent, this is what we get. Yep. Now it's not just following the position, it's also changing with the rotation of the player. That's how we're actually parenting. Now, where this parenting would help, for example, imagine having a gun attached to the player. The gun is a different game object, has its own properties, can be destroyed on its own. but it has to move fluently with the hand of the player. So parenting it to the player's hand is the best way to do it. Same with a sword. Imagine going in a bicycle. We want to parent the player to the actual car or the bicycle so that they move in the same way. Manipulating one will equal manipulating the other. Now, this may be a lot of information of concepts on Unity and how to actually manipulate in GraalScript 2. And I would highly recommend just checking other YouTube tutorials on Unity itself because these are really the basic elements and just trying to observe with the documentation on how to translate from Unity to actual GraalScript 2. It's really one of the most efficient way to do it. And really, any questions available, any questions you have, we'll be more than glad to help you out, teach you the ways and how to actually start and begin this manipulation of game objects, actually creating your custom scripts in Unity GraalScript 2.